Now, if we read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, one thing that we'll see that God has always been primarily interested is what's going on inside of our hearts. Now, the Bible identifies one man as personifying what it means to have a good heart. Now, he was Israel's second king after Saul, whom God rejected because of his disobedience. Now, the Bible makes no effort to hide David's many failures, yet he is remembered as having a heart like God's. Now, for a long time, Bible critics claimed that there was no record of David's existence outside of the Bible and dismissed David as a real historical king. Now, the critics were silenced when part of a victory stela of an Aramean king was found by Abraham Biron at Tel Dan. Now, on that victory stela of an Aramean king believed to be Hazael, he announces that he has subdued the king of Israel and another king from the house of David. Now, the kings he subdued are believed to be Ahab's son Jehoram and Jehoshaphat's grandson Ahaziah. Now, the photo on the left here is one that I took when I was at the Israel Museum on my recent trip there. Now, the story of King David is covered in 3 books of the Bible. Now, his story up until Saul's death is covered in the second half of the book of 1 Samuel. Now, his years as king are covered throughout the whole of the second book of Samuel. Now, originally, 1st and 2nd Samuel was one book, of which the prophet Samuel wrote the first half, and then some of the priests continued on finishing that particular volume. Now, a parallel account of David's years as king, minus the story of Bathsheba and Uriah, is given to us in 1 Chronicles from chapter 11 to the end of that book, which I believe is chapter 19. Now, broadly speaking, we could divide the story of David's life into 5 major parts. Now, the first part is David's early years, including his selection as king and his famous defeat of the giant Goliath, which are covered from chapter 16 to 18 of 1 Samuel. Second are his wilderness years, where he was pursued by Saul, which are covered in the second half of 1 Samuel. 3, his early years as king over Judah, and then over all of Israel, which is covered in the first 10 chapters of 2 Samuel. 4, his adultery with Bathsheba and murder of Uriah, that's told to us in 2 Samuel 11 and 12. And lastly, David's latter years as king, which are covered in the second half of the second book of Samuel. Now, today we're only going to cover his early years and his wilderness years up to the death of King Saul when he became king of Judah. Now, David was, we are told in 2 Samuel 5 that he was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 40 years from around 1009 to 969 BC, when he died at age 70, and he was followed on the throne by his son Solomon. Now, David came from the town of Bethlehem, which is about 10 kilometres south of Jerusalem in the mountains of Judah. Now, Bethlehem means the house of bread. Now, the true bread of heaven, Jesus Christ, a descendant of David, would later be born there as well. Now, David's famous great-grandparents were Ruth and Boaz, and who also came from Bethlehem. Now, the land inheritance of the family of Boaz, which passed down to David's parents, based on tradition, appears to have been on the eastern side of today's city of Bethlehem. Now, his famous great-grandparents were Boaz and Ruth. Now, they had a son called Obed, and Obed was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David. Now, the Bible tells us that David was the youngest of 7 sons. Now, his older brothers were Eliab, Abinadab, Shimeah, Nathaniel, Bradai, and Ozeb. Now, he also had 2 sisters by the names of Zeruiah and Abigail. Now, David is well known as a person that God described as being a man after his own heart. Now, let's look at the context of this famous statement about David. Now, after the first of Saul's 2 major sins that led to his rejection as king, Samuel said to Saul in 1 Samuel 13 verse 14 that God has sought a man after his own heart. Now we have to remember this expression was said when David was still a teenage boy tending his father's sheep. Now God made this famous pronouncement about David at the beginning of his rise to fame before some of his famous mistakes made later in his life. Now the pronouncement about David is repeated long after his death in Acts 13 verse 22, where Paul, in a synagogue during his first missionary journey, gives a quote from God that is basically a paraphrase rather than a direct Old Testament quote. He says, "I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, who shall fulfill all my will." So we first meet David when Samuel is told by God to go to Bethlehem to anoint one of Jesse's sons as Saul's successor as king. Now when Samuel thinks one of Jesse's sons is sure to be anointed as king, the Lord says to him, "Do not look upon his appearance or the height of his stature, for the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." Now all of David's older brothers passed by Samuel, and God says that none of them are to be anointed as king. Now Samuel then asks Jesse if he has any other sons, and Jesse says, "Well, there remains yet the youngest, and there he is out there keeping the sheep." And Samuel says then to Jesse, "Send and bring him, for we will not sit down till he comes here." So he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, with bright eyes, and good looking. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is the one." Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. Now, like with King Saul, God gave David the Holy Spirit when he was anointed king. Now, interestingly, no such record of receiving the Holy Spirit is noted as occurring when his son Solomon is later anointed as king. Now David here is referred to as being handsome with beautiful eyes, and he was ruddy. Now the Hebrew word translated as ruddy means reddish. It appears that David was a redhead or a ranger, as some people like to refer to him as. Now maybe David looked a little bit like this. Like one of his famous descendants, Prince Harry. Now after Samuel anoints him as king, God's Spirit comes upon him. Now we are not told if Samuel told David that God had already rejected Saul as king. Now David may have thought Saul was still God's choice as king up until his eventual death. Now David has no immediate thoughts of taking over as king. I mean, why would he? He is just a young boy at this stage. Now, following Samuel's disobedience and rejection as king by God, we read the following in 1 Samuel 16, verse 14. "But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a distressing spirit from the Lord troubled him. Then one of the servants answered and said, 'Look, I have seen a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a mighty man of valour, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a handsome person, and the Lord is with him.' And so it was, when the Spirit from God was upon Saul, that David would take a harp and play it with his hand. Then Saul would become refreshed and well, and the distressing spirit would depart from him." Now David is known as a skillful harp player, and because of this, from time to time, he is brought in by Saul to help soothe his terrible moods. Now David is also called a man of valour and war. Now this event here may or may not have occurred after David killed Goliath, which was recorded in the next chapter. Now the reference to him as a man of valour and war might also possibly refer to his bravery in killing a lion which had attacked one of his sheep. Now when people think about David killing the lion when protecting the sheep, often they think that David used a slingshot like he did with Goliath, but the account says that he struck the lion. Now, shepherds, as mentioned in Psalm 23, had both a rod and a staff. Now, the staff with a hook at the end was used to guide the sheep. Now, the rod was a stick with a thick knob at the end, and it was used to part and inspect the wool, and also to protect the sheep from predators. Now, it would have been one of these rods that David used to strike and then later kill the lion that stole one of David's sheep. Now, in 1 Samuel 17, we read that the Philistines come to fight Israel in the valley of Elah. Now, in verse 1 it says, "Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle and gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah. And they camped between Soko and Azekah in Ephes Dammim." Now, Tel Soko is on the right-hand side of that mountain ridge at the bottom of this photo. Now, Soko belonged to Judah, and it seems that they wanted to capture it. Now, the Philistines had come in from the west, or the left of this map, into the valley of Elah. Now, to get to Soko, they would have had to pass south of the hilltop tell of Azekah, which is shown on the top left of this photo. Now, the Philistines were camped between Azekah and Soko in Ephes Dammim. Now, Ephes Dammim means border of blood. Now, this map shows that the valley of Elah was in that buffer region between Israel and Philistia. Now, the valley is also due west of Bethlehem, where David was from. Now, Bethlehem is just visible on the mountainous ridgeline looking east of the valley. Now, continuing on in verse 2, we read, "And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the other side with a valley between them." So we see here that the Philistines are on the southern mountain ridge near Soko, while the Israelites are on the northern mountain ridge opposite of the Philistines. Now, on that northern mountain ridge are the remains of an Iron Age city with walls and two gates called Khirbet Qarfa. Now, this town has been equated by some archaeologists with the town called Sharaim, that is mentioned in verse 52, where it says, "The wounded of the Philistines fled along the road to Sharaim, even as far as Gath and Ekron." Now, the name Sharaim actually means two gates, and this rather uncommon feature does match Khirbet Qarfa on the northern mountain ridge there. Now, that said, Khirbet Qarfa is on the opposite mountain north, so why would they be heading up a road to the mountain where the Israelites were and not west to where Gath and Ekron are? Now, I doubt this, and for this reason, I doubt this hilltop tell was actually Sharaim. Now, another reason I doubt this is Sharaim is that the town dates to the Iron Age 2 period. Now, while this date matches on the standard chronology, the Iron Age is much later in the revised chronology that I personally support and have discussed in previous messages. Now, in between the Israelites and the Philistines on the opposite mountain ridges was the brook Elah. Now, today is mostly dry, but it would have flowed back in the time of David. Now, on the right of this map, I've also noted the kibbutz, where I stayed with the Robertsons and the Nelsons for a week when we participated in a dig at Tel Burna. So it was very cool to be able to stay in this historic valley where David killed Goliath. Now, in between the Israelites and the Philistines on the opposite mountain ridges was the brook Elah. Now, from this brook is where David picked up 5 smooth stones for his slingshot. Now, to give you a better feel for the battlefield, here is some drone footage that I took on my recent trip to Israel. Now, we start here with the view looking southeast to the valley of Elah from Azekah, which was at the top left of the previous aerial map. Now, on the opposite side of that road there are 2 mountain ridges. Now, the one on the left is where the Israelites were camped, and the far one on the right is the one where the Philistines were camped. And now we're looking at Tel Soko on the southern mountain ridge where the Philistines were camped. And here we're looking east towards Bethlehem and the Judean mountains. Now looking east here we can see the kibbutz that we were staying in, and in between there is the brook Elah where David extracted 5 smooth stones for using in his slingshot. And now we're looking north across the mountain ridge to where the Israelites were camped. Now amongst the Philistines is a giant named Goliath, who is 6 cubits and a span. Now that equates to about 9 feet, 9 inches, or 3 metres tall. Now he comes from the town of Gath, which is the closest Philistine city to the valley of Elah, just west of the valley. Now he had a bronze helmet and a coat of bronze chainmail that was 5,000 shekels in weight. He had an iron spearhead on his spear, which was 600 shekels in weight. Now, some very interesting arrowheads in the Israel Museum, which archaeologist Joel Kramer points to as evidence of giants in Israel. Now, notice the giant one in the photo on the left compared to the small one that's right next to it in the bottom right of the photo. Now these were made from bronze. Now, Goliath's spearhead was made of iron, so this is obviously not Goliath's. But you get some idea of the size of how big it could have been. Now the bottom right photo here shows scales of bronze chainmail like that worn by Goliath. Now day after day, Goliath challenges Israel for a single man-on-man combat battle. Now all the Israelites are too afraid to challenge him. Now this includes in particular King Saul, who was head and shoulders above all the Israelite men, yet even he was too afraid to take on Goliath. Now David comes down from Jerusalem with provisions for his brothers and inquires what's happening. Now his oldest brother Eliab gives him a really hard time about being there. I mean, you can imagine Eliab stirring him up saying, "David, the sheep are calling out to you, come back." Now David goes to Saul and he courageously offers to fight Goliath. Now when he talks to Saul saying he will fight Goliath, he tells Saul that he trusts God to give him deliverance, just as God backed him up and gave him deliverance from a lion and a bear while protecting his sheep. Now Saul reluctantly agrees and offers his armour, which David declines, taking only his staff, sling and 5 stones from a brook. Now David was full of confidence, but not in his own ability. He was confident in God's power to back up his actions when he went up against Goliath. Now to Goliath, he said over in 1 Samuel 17, "You come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. The Lord will deliver you into my hand today, and all this multitude shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's." Now it's hard not to love his courage and complete confidence in God to back him up. He is only concerned with God's will and honour, and he has complete trust that God will back him up, as he did with the lion and bear previously. Now when you are passionate about God's will and caring for others, it can give you great courage to push through and do the right thing, even when you are afraid. Now Goliath did have a defensive weapon to protect himself with his shield, but he was either too complacent with it in his defence, or his armour bearer did not hold it up high enough. Now God ensured that the stone hit him right between the eyes and killed him. Now it turned out to be more lethal than a bouncer from Jeff Thompson. Now afterwards, David cuts off the head of Goliath, and the Philistines flee and are pursued by the Israelites as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron. Now verse 54 says that David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armour in his tent. Now Jerusalem was controlled by the Jebusites at this time, so he likely took it there after he later conquered Jerusalem. Now he took his sword as well, as it was given back to him at Nob by the priest Ahimelech when Saul was chasing him. Now, Goliath represented evil and the children of the devil. Now, was the defeat of Goliath a type of the messianic prophecy in Genesis 3:15, where it says, "He shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel"? Now, some have speculated on the connection between the skull of Goliath of Gath that was taken to Jerusalem and Golgotha, a very similar sounding word, which means the place, the skull, where Jesus was crucified. I mean, was Goliath's head possibly buried at Golgotha? Now, this incredible victory by David over Goliath brings us to our first lesson that we can learn from King David. Courageously and completely trust God, as David did when he took on Goliath. Now, faith is built up like exercising and building muscle, one act of trust at a time upon another. Now, David had previously taken leaps of faith, trusting God to deliver him when he defended his sheep against a lion and a bear. Now, past miracles such as what David had experienced before taking on Goliath helped to build up his courage and trust in God. Now, when we face near impossible challenges, we have to remember the previous times that God has delivered us and do our part in stepping out in faith and trusting him to back us up like David did. Now, in 1 Samuel 18, we then read, "Now when he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Now Saul took him that day and would not let him go to his father's house anymore. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan took off the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armour, even to his sword and his bow and his belt. So David went out wherever Saul sent him and behaved wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants." Now, the noble character of Jonathan is really quite astonishing in his dealings with David and Saul, and quite a contrast to that of his father and also his bloodthirsty brothers. Now, Jonathan would have made a very fine king had Saul been more obedient to God. Now, Saul was somewhere between 30 and 40 years older than David. Now, Jonathan, being his firstborn son, would probably have been about 10 to 20 years older than David. Yet they connected very deeply as friends, and a big part of that would have been their deep love for God. Now, despite being much older, Jonathan has this wonderful humility to play second fiddle alongside of David. Now, Jonathan, as Saul's oldest son, could have expected to be the next king, but he must have had a deep relationship with God and accepted that David was to be the next king, as he symbolically gave David his robe, armour, sword, and his bow. Now, had Jonathan been alongside David during his years as king, he probably would have helped David to avoid some of the costly mistakes he made later during his time as king. And we also see here in this passage that Saul is now setting David over the soldiers when they go out to battle. Now, in 1 Samuel 18, we read how Saul became very jealous of David when women sang, "Saul has killed 1,000 enemies, David has killed 10,000 enemies." Now, it happened as they were coming home when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistines, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. So the women sang as they danced and said, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Then Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him, and he said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they've only ascribed thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom?" So Saul eyed or never trusted David from that time forward. Now we then read that Saul then tries to kill David twice with a javelin before David escapes. Now Saul then tries to have David and his men go after David and kill him. Now by this time, Jonathan has struck up a very deep friendship with David, and so he intercedes on David's behalf. He manages to persuade Saul not to kill him, and David comes back to court for a time. Now when he is back at court, he is offered the hand of Saul's daughter Michal. Now he says to him that he is poor. When he says that he is poor, he's told in response, "The king doesn't desire any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's enemies." But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. Now this plan then backfires on Saul, as David succeeds in killing enough Philistines to provide this Saul with this rather unusual dowry. Now we then read that the distressing spirit later came upon Saul again, and he tries to spear David. And this time, both Jonathan and his wife Michal, who is the daughter of Saul, assist David in escaping from the hand of Saul. Now David's wife Michal cares for David and also helped him to escape by placing an image in his bed with a wig of goat's hair to give the impression that David was under the blankets. Now the Hebrew word for image here is the word teraphim, which means an idol. Now it makes you wonder why David's wife Michal has an idol nearby to give the impression that David was under the blankets. Now is it possible that idolatry on her part was the snare to David that Saul thought she might be to him? Now shown here is Saul's hometown, that was also his capital at Gibeah. That is about 5 kilometres north of Jerusalem. Now this would have been the site of King Saul's palace. Now David also lived here with his first wife Michal, who was Saul's daughter. Now that was up until the time of Saul's jealousy driving David away. Now you can note here at the top of the tell here an empty shell of a building. Now this is built by King Hussein of Jordan, who began work on a royal palace on the ancient Tell known as Tell el-Ful. Now he finished work on it after the 1967 Six-Day War, when this area transferred from Jordan to Israel. Only an outer shell of it remains today. Now the first place that David flees to after leaving Saul's palace was a few kilometres north at Ramah, where the prophet Samuel lived. Now on 3 occasions, Saul's men and then Saul himself tried to go there and kill David, but God's Spirit temporarily moved them to prophesy with the other prophets. Now on each occasion, these men were far from thinking God's thoughts, but God moved them to not only cease pursuing David, but to come back prophesying to God. Now God can control us against our natural will if he wants to, but he doesn't do that, as that would remove our free moral agency. Now this occasion here is one of those very rare exceptions to that. Now on this slide we're going to trace David's movements shown by the red line up to the cave of Adullam. Now the orange line here shows his trip after that to Moab to hide his parents from Saul. Now after fleeing to Ramah, David catches up with Jonathan. Now later Saul's angry actions show Jonathan that he fully intends to kill David. Now they make a covenant of peace and say their goodbyes to each other. Now David and Saul, while David is in his 20s, play this cat and mouse game where David tries to avoid being killed by Saul. Now David then heads south to Nob, which is believed to be just north of Jerusalem, possibly near Mount Scopus. Now at this point in time, the Ark of the Covenant is at Kirjath Jearim, a few miles west of Jerusalem. Now the tabernacle, however, appears to be at Nob, following the destruction of Shiloh. Now the showbread that David is given shows that the tabernacle of service was going on there at Nob. Now Ahimelech helps David with food and gives him the sword of Goliath. Now David then tries to enter the Philistine city of Gath to escape Saul. Now this is such a bizarre move on David's part. Of all places to go, why go to Gath, the city where Goliath came from? I mean, he's previously killed their champion. It didn't make any sense for the man who was sustained by the sacred bread of God to then seek refuge amongst the pagans. Now he's acting on fear here and not acting on faith, as he previously did when he fought Goliath. Now the servants of Achish said to King Achish, "Is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of him to one another in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s? Now it seems here that the Philistines have heard about the hit song about David killing 10,000s. They also say, is this not David, the king of the land? Now David Guzik in his commentary says, the Philistines of Gath recognised David as the king of the land of Israel. These ungodly men understood David's destiny better than King Saul. End of quote. Now, knowing that they recognised him, David then became very afraid, and in order to get away from Gath, he feigns madness. He scratched on the doors of the gate and let his saliva fall down on his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, Look, you see the man is insane. Why have you brought him to me? Have I need of a madman, that you have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? Now the trick to not fall captive to them when he realised he was recognised worked, as we read at the start of the next chapter, 1 Samuel 22. David therefore departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. So when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they came down there to him. And everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him. So he became captain over them, and there were about 400 men with him. Now he then goes to the cave of Adullam, where 400 others under distress come and join him. Now he then takes his parents to be protected by the king of Moab before he returns back to the forest of Hereth. Now you have to remember why he went to Moab. His great-grandmother Ruth was a Moabitess. Now when we were in Israel, we went and visited the cave of Adullam, which is a relatively short drive from the valley of Elah, where we were based for a week. Now there's a whole network of caves that could accommodate quite a lot of people there. Now Saul later finds out that David was assisted by the priests at Nob, who claimed no knowledge that David had become Saul's enemy. Now with the help of Doeg, the Edomite, Saul kills 85 priests at Nob, and only Abiathar, son of Ahimelech, escapes. Now in time, the line of Abiathar will relocate the temple to the high place of Gibeon, where it will stay until the temple is built. Now nothing is more revealing of the extent of the King Saul's derangement than the senseless slaughter of the 85 priests at Nob that is noted in 1 Samuel 22. Now this evil, murderous act would, in the laws of Israel, have earned Saul the death penalty in God's eyes and made him unfit to remain as king. Now after the priests at Nob were killed by Saul, Abiathar, son of Ahimelech, brought to David the ephod, or the breastplate that contained the Urim and the Thummim, through which they could inquire about matters directly from God. Now the words Urim and Thummim mean lights and perfections, or lights and darkness, depending on your source. Now nothing is known for sure about how they worked. Now one school of thought is that they were two gemstones that lit up in response to yes or no questions to God. Perhaps one was a green emerald and the other was a red ruby. The other school of thought is that they had two sides like heads and tails and were flipped to answer yes or no questions, a little bit like the game of two up. Now it's thought that this is how they would cast lots. Now just imagine how cool it would be to be able to ask God yes or no questions at any time you want to by means of the Urim and the Thummim. Now it is recorded on 5 occasions during David's life that he consulted God this particular way. Now the 2 times before he did so before he became king were when he asked whether they should save Keilah from the Philistines and whether they should pursue the Amalekites when they kidnapped the women and children at Ziklag. Now nothing is recorded of David inquiring of God this way when he decided to go and live with Israel's enemy, the Philistines. Now while that was a very questionable decision, it did however give him the opportunity to deal with the remaining Amalekites on his rather clandestine raids. Now that said, there is a rather obvious question David did not ask God about, even though he did have access to the Urim and the Thummim. David never asked God if he was to be God's instrument in removing Saul from being king. Now, there is nothing in God's rejection of Saul in 1 Samuel 15 that implies he was to be king for the rest of his life. And Saul had shed innocent blood when he had killed the priests before David had even spared his life the first time at En-gedi. Now, that alone would have earned him the death penalty under God's law. Now, David, despite not trusting Saul, still cared deeply for his father-in-law, as we see when Saul later dies. And it appears that the idea of killing him was absolutely repugnant to him. Now, he could have at any time consulted the Urim and Thummim to clarify God's means of removing Saul as king, but he didn't. Now, maybe God was behind that oversight in order to test David's character. Now, on this slide, we'll look at David's movements after his time in Moab and his return to the forest of Hereth, which is shown in brown. Now, David and his men, first of all, saved the town of Keilah from the Philistines. Now, after Keilah is saved from the Philistines, David then flees south of Hebron in the Judean wilderness to Ziph, then on to Maon, where Saul almost captures him, and then he goes to En-gedi. Now, Saul then pursues him down to the En-gedi oasis, very close to the Dead Sea, which has a number of nearby caves. Now, En-gedi, with its lush vegetation and living flowing water, is a great contrast to the nearby Dead Sea, which you see in the drone footage that I took there. Now, 1 Samuel 24 starts off by saying, "Now it happened when Saul had returned from following the Philistines that it was told him, saying, 'Take note, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi.' Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and went to seek David and his men on the rocks of the wild goats. So he came to the sheepfolds by the road where there was a cave, and Saul went in to attend to his needs." In brackets, David and his men were staying in the recesses of the cave. Then the men of David said to him, "This is the day of which the Lord has said to you, Behold, I will deliver your enemy into your hand, that you may do to him as it seems good to you." And David arose and secretly cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Now Saul goes into a cave that he doesn't realise that David is in to relieve himself. And David's men see this as God's way of delivering Saul into David's hand. Now David rejects this viewpoint and chooses not to kill him. Instead, he cuts off a corner of his robe to prove to Saul that he doesn't wish to harm him. Now notice David's humility here and how he addresses Saul at En-gedi. Now he was willing to lower himself, saying that he was of no great importance. He even called himself a dead dog and a flea, because being reconciled meant so much more to him than his pride and avenging himself. Now, just as pride comes before a fall, so too does humility come before a restoration of any friendship. Now here, David uses the power of humility and kindness to win back Saul's favour. Now Saul temporarily repents of trying to kill him. Now sadly, it was only temporary, and ultimately Saul's insecurity got the better of him later on. Now this brings us to the second lesson that we can learn from King David. Use humility and kindness and not retaliation as a way to restore broken friendships. Now in 1 Samuel 24:22 it says, "And Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold." Now back a couple of chapters it says, "So he brought them," talking about David's parents, "before the king of Moab, and they dwelt with him all the time that David was in the stronghold." Now it seems that this stronghold was the fortress where the king of Moab lived. Now 1 Samuel 22:3 calls it Mizpah of Moab. Now when we were in Jordan and we ascended from near the Dead Sea to travel east, we ran across this castle and assumed it was just another Arab or Crusader castle. We were quite unaware of how far back this castle goes. Now it goes back to at least the time of King Mesha of Moab, from Ahab's time. Now, the ascent from the Dead Sea is some 4,000 feet, and then we come upon this rather imposing castle, which is referred to as Carrick Castle. Now, Google tells us the following about Mizpah in Moab. It says that Mizpah, meaning watchtower, was either a royal city or fortress in Moab to which David removed his parents for safety during his persecution by Saul. Now, modern day sites suggested as its possible location, including Kerek, Kir Moab, and Ramjum, or whatever, in Jordan. Now, is it possible that Carrick Castle was the stronghold where the king of Moab gave sanctuary to David's parents? Now, it is when he is in the stronghold of Moab that the prophet Samuel dies and is buried at Ramah. Now, after he goes to the stronghold, which is likely to be Mizpah of Moab, where his parents are, David is next noted as being in Carmel, where he meets Abigail. Now, when most people think of Carmel here, they think immediately of Mount Carmel up in the north of Israel. Now, it is possible that might be where David goes to next, as soon after he takes Abigail as a wife, he also takes Ahinoam of Jezreel as a wife also. And we know that Jezreel is very close to Mount Carmel. However, there is also a Carmel in Judah, which I think is the more likely place for the story. It says that David went to the wilderness of Paran, which is in the deep south, and that Nabal was from Maon, also in that same area, and his business and where he sheared his sheep was in Carmel. Now, the Judean Carmel is very close to Maon. Now, Ahinoam from Jezreel probably came down to Judea when she met David, in my view. Now, David and his men are noted as being up in the region of Carmel, where the story of his dealings with Nabal and his wife Abigail take place. Now, Abigail intercedes on behalf of her foolish husband. Now, following Nabal's death by a heart attack, she agrees to be David's wife. Now, David's first wife, Michal, was taken off him and given to another man by Saul. Now, later, David would ask for and receive her back from Saul's son Ishbosheth after he later became king. Now, Abigail is noted here as being both wise and good-looking. Now, despite that, at about the same time, David also takes another wife, Ahinoam, who bears him his first son Amnon, who later rapes his half-sister Tamar. Now, David here has begun his slide into polygamy, which was forbidden to the kings of Israel. Now, while forbidden to Israel's kings, one reason it was often practiced was that it gave women a certain amount of physical and financial security in a world with lots of widows because of the often constant warfare. It was often viewed as the lesser of two evils by women in the ancient world. Now, David then spares Saul's life again in the wilderness of Ziph, where he sneaks into his camp while he's asleep and takes his spear and water jar to prove again that he means Saul no harm. Now, Saul again repents of trying to kill him. Now, this time David snaps after the second apparent reconciliation with Saul. Now, David loses all faith in Saul not going after him again, and he flees to the Philistine city of Gath to be beyond his reach. I mean, what is David thinking here? Of all places, he goes to Gath, the hometown of Goliath. Now, the first time he went there, he was recognised and pretended to be a madman to avoid being taken by the Gittites. Now, the second time appears from the account that he had much better success. Now, verses 1 to 4 of 1 Samuel 27 says, David said in his heart, "Now I shall perish someday by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than I should speedily escape to the land of the Philistines, and Saul will despair of me to seek me any more in any part of Israel. So I shall escape out of his hand." Then David arose and went over with the 600 men who were with him to Achish, the son of Maach, king of Gath. So David dwelt with Achish in Gath, he and his men, each man with his household, and David with his two wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the Carmelitess, Nabal's widow. And it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, so he sought him no more. Now, did Achish just welcome David with open arms? Now, the account seems to read that way, but there is a detail in the book of Psalms that puts this whole scenario into a different light. Now, David Guzik in his commentary says the following: David knew he was discovered and understood that King Achish would not let the man who killed Goliath go. Now, David's words in Psalms 56 help us to understand what happened here. The title of that psalm identifies it as the song he wrote when the Philistines captured him in Gath. Apparently, although 1 Samuel doesn't detail it, the Philistines captured David when he came to Gath. David thought he could find anonymity or sympathy among the ungodly Philistines in Gath, but he was wrong. Psalms 56 describes David's journey from fear to praising as a prisoner in Gath. End of quote. So this wasn't quite such a bright move after all. Now that said, God then begins to turn things around for David. Saul stops chasing him, and somehow, we're not told, God grants him favour, and a lot of it in the eyes of King Achish. Somehow he manages to persuade the king of Gath that he is not his enemy, and the king of Gath gives David and his men the town of Ziklag. Now here is a view of Tel Es-Safi, which most scholars believe to be ancient Gath, where Goliath came from and where David fled to in order to escape Saul. Now we were quite amazed at how big this particular Tel was. Now that is mainly because it is built on a natural hill with limestone caves and it's not an artificial Tel like a number of others. Now the area around the summit, which we're coming up to now, is the upper city, and it would have been where King Achish would have dwelt. And there's the summit now. Now, like I said, somehow he manages to persuade the king of Gath that he is not his enemy, and the king of Gath gives David and his men the town of Ziklag. Now, a number of candidates have been put forth for Ziklag. Now, the strongest contender at this time is Khirbet el-Arai, close to Lachish. Now, here's some drone footage of the site. Now, of all the sites that I visited in Israel, this one is the one by far had the most number of thorns to contend with when you're walking around it. Now, after a year and a half of living with the Philistines, everything suddenly went pear-shaped for poor old David. Now, while returning to Ziklag after being rejected by the Philistine princes, the Amalekites, in retaliation for David's clandestine raids upon them, burn Ziklag and capture the women and children. Now, after consulting God on the matter, David and his men then pursue the Amalekites and recover all the people that the Amalekites had kidnapped. Now, in Saul's final days, the Philistines mounted new attacks on the Israelite heartland. At no time able to deliver a strong enough blow to their persistent enemy, Saul gathered his forces at Mount Gilboa near the Jezreel Valley to drive the Philistines into the valley of Jezreel. Now, 1 Chronicles 10 verses 13 and 14 summarises Saul's sad end. So Saul died for his unfaithfulness which he had committed against the Lord, because he did not keep the word of the Lord, and also because he consulted a medium for guidance. Therefore he killed him and turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. Now Saul and Jonathan and two of his other sons were killed on Mount Gilboa, bringing an end to the sad reign of King Saul. Now David grieved very deeply for the loss of not just Jonathan, but also Saul as well. Now he then inquired of God what to do next, and so he ended up going up to Hebron. And it says in 2 Samuel 2:4, "Then the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah." Now King Saul has died, and David, now at age 30, has now become the king of Judah. Now, after some civil war with one of Saul's sons, Ishbosheth, he will later become king over the rest of Israel. So that brings us up to the time of David becoming king. So on that note, we'll conclude part 1 of Lessons from David. Now, when I'm up here next time, we'll continue part 2, where we'll examine the reign of King David when he becomes king till his eventual death at age 70. Thank you. Well, good morning, brethren. Now, last time in part 1 of Lessons from David, we covered the life of David up until the age of 30 when he became king. Now, he was anointed as the future king when he was a teenager, and soon after rose to prominence when he courageously took on the giant Goliath and killed him with a stone from a slingshot. Now, after marrying into Saul's family and leading many battles, Saul then turned on David out of jealousy and for about 5 years chased him all over southern Israel. And in the end, out of fear, he ended up fleeing to Israel's arch enemies, the Philistines, to escape Saul. Now, God miraculously gave him favour with the king of Gath, who gave him and his men the town of Ziklag to settle in. Now, following the rescue of their women and children after the Amalekites had raided and burned Ziklag, David then returned back to Ziklag. Now, on the third day back, an Amalekite by chance who was at Mount Gilboa when Saul died comes to Ziklag to tell him of Saul's death, presenting David with Saul's crown and bracelet. Now, David has him killed after he tells the story of finishing off Saul's death at Saul's insistence. Now, later, when told of the death of Saul's son, he says, "When someone told me saying, 'Look, Saul is dead,' thinking to have brought good news, I arrested him and had him executed in Ziklag, the one who thought I would give him a reward for his news." Now, David greatly mourns both Saul and Jonathan and then inquires of God where he should go to next. And God tells him to go to Hebron, the largest city in the tribal area of Judah. Now, the elders of Judah then have David crowned as king over the tribe of Judah following the deaths of Saul and Jonathan. Now, following the lead of Saul's commander Abner, the other tribes of Israel decide not to follow David and choose to follow Saul's youngest son Ishbosheth, who was crowned despite Saul's crown being given to David by the Amalekite who killed Saul. Now, for Ishbosheth's coronation, they take him to Mahanaim next to Penuel, on the opposite side of the Jordan River, where Jacob wrestled with God. So that's the significance of that particular location. Now, as the northern tribes followed the existing dynasty of Saul, the northern tribes were able to retain the name Israel for the northern kingdom. And there is then civil war for about 7 years between the two kingdoms. Now, David's first capital, Hebron, is a very important city to the Jews, as this is where Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah were all buried in the cave of the patriarchs. Now, King Herod, an Edomite who was raised in the Jewish religion, built this structure above the cave. Now, its stones are very similar to the stones of the temple in Jerusalem, yet it has actually survived intact to this day. Now, shown here is the town of Hebron, which is important because of its connection with the patriarchs. Now, close to the cave of the patriarchs is Tel Hebron. Now, other than a few sherds of late bronze pottery, very little has been uncovered from the late bronze period. Now, in the revised chronology that I support, the late bronze period is when David rules Judah for 7 years before he becomes king over both Israel and Judah and moves his capital Jerusalem following the conquest of that city. Now, there is likely to be more evidence of a late bronze city here at Hebron, but the Acropolis, the likely site for David's palace, is basically unexcavated due to the sensitive political situation that is there in the West Bank today. Now, while it would have looked much different in David's time, he would have been able to look down directly to where the Machpelah cave was, where 3 couples of his direct lineage were buried: Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah, who was the mother of Judah, from whom David descended from. Now, in the civil war between Israel and Judah, there is one particularly fierce battle at Gibeon, a few miles northwest of Jerusalem, between Abner's forces and Joab's forces. Now, Abner kills Joab's brother, but Abner loses a lot more men in this particular battle. Now, Abner, following an arrogant act on the part of Ishbosheth, then defects to David's side. Now, David makes a covenant with him for his help to bring the rest of Israel over to David's side. Now, after the covenant is made, Joab, who objects to it, kills Abner in retaliation for him killing his brother. Now, seeing that Judah is clearly winning the civil war against Israel, two captains under Ishbosheth, seeing the writing on the wall, kill Ishbosheth and go to David with his head, thinking that David would reward them for killing him. Now, David is horrified by what they have done, and he has them executed and hung by the pool in Hebron. Now, following the murder of Ishbosheth, the elders of the other tribes decide to follow David, and they pledge their allegiance to him, and he is anointed king over Israel. Now, does this mean that the two nations became one nation again, like it was under King Saul? Now, most people assume that there was just one nation under David and Solomon, and Israel broke into two nations after Solomon, but is this what happened? Now, upon closer examination of the biblical record, we'll see that this wasn't the case. Now, notice in 2 Samuel 5:5, it states that David reigned 33 years as king over Israel and Judah. Now, we see further evidence of two separate kingdoms under one crowned ruler in the story of David numbering Israel. Now, David tells Joab to number Israel and Judah, and when Joab gives the numbers, he gives separate figures for the two kingdoms. Now, the dynastic union over two separate kingdoms here is similar to what happened after the death of Queen Elizabeth I in the United Kingdom. The next in line for the throne of England was King James VI of Scotland. Now, he became James I of England and ruled both England and Scotland, which continued as separate nations with separate parliaments before their union a century later in 1707, which saw the birth of the United Kingdom. Now, ironically, the name United Kingdom is also the name used by historians for the nation of Israel between King Saul and Solomon. Now, late in the reign of David, there was tension between the two kingdoms that led to a temporary breakup. Now, Sheba led the northern tribes of Israel to rebel and briefly break away after Absalom's death, but Joab was able to put down that particular rebellion. Now, this dynastic union over two separate kingdoms continued into the reign of Solomon, as seen in a couple of passages. Now, David told Zadok and Nathan to anoint Solomon king over Israel and Judah. And in two places in 1 Kings 4, it speaks of the prosperity of Judah and Israel throughout the reign of King Solomon. Now, the tension between the two kingdoms spilled over after Solomon's death, leading to a permanent separation of the two kingdoms with separate rulers, following the foolish choice of Rehoboam when Israel cried out for tax relief. Now, when David became king over Judah, he had two wives, Abigail, the widow of Nabal, and Ahinoam, the Jezreelitess. Now, he negotiated with Abner at the time he made that covenant with him to regain his original wife, Michal. Now, in those first 7 years as king of Judah at Hebron, before David moves to Jerusalem, 2 Samuel 3 tells us that he takes even more wives. At least one seems to be a political marriage with the daughter of the king of Geshur, which is just northeast of the Sea of Galilee. Now, this passage shows that in his 7 years at Hebron, David had 6 sons from 6 different wives. At this point, he has at least 7 wives, if you include Michal, who bore David no children. Now, one of David's early acts as king over Israel is the capture of the town of Jebus from the Canaanite Jebusites. Now, Jebus would become the city of Jerusalem, or the city of David, after it was taken from the Jebusites. Now, Jerusalem had certain advantages as a capital for David. It was centrally located. It was in the tribal area of the small tribe of Benjamin and not the greater tribes of Ephraim, Manasseh, or Judah. And by capturing it with soldiers from each tribe, it was an enterprise that all tribes could play a part in. Now, the walls of Jerusalem's old city that we see today were built in the 1500s by the Ottoman Turks. Now, the original city of David is just outside of the walls of Jerusalem's old city. Now, it was on a ridge to the south of the old city's southeast corner, south of the Temple Mount. Now, this is an aerial photo of what Jerusalem looked like in 1910. Now, you should be able to make out the walls surrounding the old city. Now, it would look very similar to this back in 1867 when Queen Victoria sent Sir Charles Warren to find some of the treasures of the Bible, such as the Ark of the Covenant. Now, at the time Charles Warren went to Jerusalem, the whole world, including the Jews, did not realise the whole of Jerusalem in David's time lay just outside of the current city walls of the old city. Now, before that time, it was assumed that the Jerusalem of David's time was inside the old city walls. Now, following the conquest by the Arabs in the 600s AD, the area to the south of the Temple Mount was gradually abandoned and forgotten with simple farming terraces, as you can see in this photo. Now, even the term Mount Zion was mistakenly applied to the hill to the southwest of the Temple Mount that lay just south of the old city walls, shown here in orange. Now, this hill is where the upper room is, which is the traditional site for the Last Supper. Now, this area did not become enclosed within the walls of Jerusalem until the time of Hezekiah. Now, in Roman times, it was known as the Upper City. Now, even today, since the rediscovery of the city of David, many people still refer to this hill as Mount Zion, and there is even a place on this hill that claims to have the tomb of David. Now, 1 Kings 2:10 is clear that David was buried within the city of David, not on the southwest hill. Now, when Charles Warren went to Jerusalem, the Ottoman Turks were the ones in charge of Jerusalem at the time, and they denied him the chance to excavate the Temple Mount, though he was able to explore and survey a lot of the underground chambers. Now, following that disappointment, Warren was walking along the Kidron Valley to the south of the Temple Mount when he found the Gihon Spring. Now, as he explored around the Gihon, he crawled through a tunnel that went horizontal for 20 metres before it went vertical some 13 metres above his head. Now, with great effort, he climbed up the shaft, which then continued at a 45-degree angle for some way before it exited at the top of the ridge that slopes down south from the temple. Now, with Warren's subsequent discovery of Hezekiah's tunnel that also starts at the Gihon Spring, and the finding of the Siloam inscription in 1884, which records the construction of Hezekiah's tunnel, it was announced then to the world the rediscovery of the true city of David. Now, since then, many people thought that Warren had actually retraced the steps of Joab, who took up David's challenge to go up the Senor, or water pipe, to get into the city and let David's men in to conquer Jerusalem. Now, it was assumed that the Gihon Spring was actually outside the city walls at the time that David conquered the city, and scaling Warren's shaft was assumed the likely way that Joab entered the city. However, excavations done in the 1990s uncovered remains of giant towers and walls that confirmed that the Canaanites protected the water of the Gihon Springs, with an extension of the city walls east into the Kidron Valley, as illustrated here. Now, these impressive walls made the Canaanites feel cocky when David tried to conquer the city, claiming that the blind and the lame could defend the city. Now, notice on this diagram the position of the original Canaanite wall, northern Canaanite wall, level with that extension to the Gihon Spring. Now, just inside that northern wall, up the top, was the Jebusite fortress called Zion. Now, the word Zion means highest point or heavenly, and has come to be a name that represents the whole of the city of Jerusalem. Now, there was not enough room for David's palace inside the small city, so when he built that later, it was built just outside and up against the original northern wall after he conquered the city. Now, there was also an underground tunnel that went from the Gihon spring under those extended walls that protected the spring along the Kidron Valley and down to the Pool of Siloam. So knowing that, how would you then attack and conquer the city? Now, there was only one way to get underneath the walls, and that was the underground Canaanite tunnel which went along the Kidron Valley. Now, here's a photo I took of that massive spring tower that guarded the walls of the Gihon spring. Now, David had some intel that he thought would help with the conquest of the Jebusite city. Now, he knew about a water shaft that gave access to it. And now that we know that the spring was surrounded by the city walls, this water shaft had to be that Canaanite tunnel, not Warren's shaft. And even though he was already commander, Joab took up the challenge that was offered by David. Now, Joab would have had to start from the Pool of Siloam, which was possibly guarded itself, go up the Canaanite tunnel underneath the Kidron Valley, where it then went through or under the spring fortress wall, came out at the Canaanite pool near the Gihon spring. And again, this was probably guarded. And then head up the walkway to the city to find the gate to let David's army in. Now, this was a tough challenge, as this is quite a narrow tunnel, as shown in the photo on the right-hand side when a few of our tour group went through part of it. And because it is the only way underneath the walls, it is a natural place that you would guard well. Now, it is likely that, given their attitude, that the Canaanites were too relaxed and complacent in their defence. Now, David and his troops conquered the city, including the Jebusite fortress, which he lived in until he built his own palace. Now, here's a bit of local trivia for you. Around Kedron Brook here in Brisbane was actually named by German missionaries after the Kidron Brook that ran through the Kidron Valley later in Jesus' time. Now, a little closer to the temple from the Gihon spring and up near the top of the eastern slope of the city David, Kathleen Kenyon in the 1960s, after her excavations at Jericho, discovered this enormous stepped stone structure shown here, which would have later been determined to be a massive retaining wall for a monumental structure at the top of it, which Alet Mazar discovered 45 years later in 2005, which she claims is David's palace. Now, notice the building at the bottom of the retaining wall. Now, inscriptional evidence pointed to it belonging to a man named Ahiel, later around the time of Hezekiah. Now, if David's palace was at the top of that stone-step retaining wall, you could imagine Uriah and Bathsheba's house perhaps being in the same location as the house of Ahiel, where David could look down onto its rooftop where Bathsheba was likely bathing. Now, in the bottom right photo, you could actually see a toilet that was actually found in that house. Now, about this stone step structure, David Roll writes the following in his book, A Test of Time. In 1961, Dame Kathleen Kenyon began her 7-year excavations of the eastern slopes of the ancient city of Jerusalem. She had found a vast stone terracing system which stretched along the east scarp of the old city. Now, it had been estimated that this extension of the city summit added at least 6,000 square metres to the occupational area of early Jerusalem. Dame Kathleen Kenyon believed that she had uncovered the Millo of Solomon and duly announced her discovery in the pages of the Palestinian Exploration Quarterly. However, once again, there was a problem. The associated pottery in the filling material of the terraces proved to belong to the late Bronze Age. And she wrote, "There was not a great way in the way of finds in the fill, but there was enough pottery, including a few sherds of Mycenaean ware and white slip 2 milk bowls, to show that the date is 14th century BC. Now this is a date that's over 300 years earlier than King David. Now her solution to this dilemma was to retain her identification of the great stone terraces with the biblical Millo, but then to doctor or reinterpret the passage in 1 Kings 9:15 relating to the building works of Solomon. She proposed that the Israelite king had not built the Millo, as the Old Testament states, but rather rebuilt or repaired it. Now Mazar later concluded that the palace, shown in blue in the diagram at the bottom, which sits atop of Kenyon's stone step structure, is actually interconnected and would have been built at the same time as the palace. So the archaeology here says that the palace and the retaining wall were built at the same time. Now the Bible indicates it should be dated to the time of David, but the pottery dated by the dates men have assigned to Egyptian pharaohs says it's over 300 years older. So how do we reconcile this problem? Now those who propose a revised Egyptian chronology, such as David Roll and Emanuel Velikovsky, believe that the late Bronze period, the time of the 18th and 19th dynasties, was contemporary with the time of David and Solomon, not 300 years earlier, which would reconcile this dating problem of David's palace and its retaining wall. Now the photos of the excavations in the last slides show what this area looked like up until the 1990s, before the City of David Archaeological Tourist Park was created, which has completely transformed the look of this site. Now the property at the top of the picture was bought out, and this would later be where the entrance to the tourist park would be. But before that could be completed, Eilat Mazar discovered what she believes was David's palace. Now underneath the visitor centre and at the top of the stone step structure is this monumental building uncovered in 2005 by Eilat Mazar, which she believes is King David's palace. Now there are 2 burnt stamp seals called bullae with the names of 2 individuals noted in Jeremiah 36 were actually found in this building. And this indicates that it still served as a governmental building after Solomon had built another palace higher up, closer to the temple. Now there's one very interesting prophecy in Jeremiah 30 verse 18 where God says, "Behold, I bring back the captivity of Jacob's tents and have mercy on his dwelling places. The city shall be built upon its own mound, and the palace shall remain according to its plan." Now this may well refer to David's palace, whose foundations have now been found. Now this prophecy comes several verses after it speaks of the time of Jacob's trouble and God raising up David by a resurrection to again rule over Israel, indicating it may refer to the time after the second coming of the Messiah. Now this is what the stone step retaining wall of the palace looks like today. Now notice in the bottom photo the seating that is facing the retaining wall. Now that is for people watching the sound and light show that is shown here in the evenings. Now between the top of the wall and the flowers in the top left photo is the palace. Now above it is the visitor centre to the City of David, and then above that, would you believe, they're building a restaurant directly above David's palace. Now in the top right of the right-hand photo, you might just be able to make out the City of David lookout point to the right of the visitor centre. And just to blow you away, here is David's palace as it might have looked like, being projected onto that retaining wall of King David's palace during the sound and light show. Now after David had captured Jerusalem and made it made it the new capital of all of Israel, he wanted to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. Now, for 20 years, it had been in the house of the priest of Abinadab, which was on a hill in Kirjath Jearim, shown in the top left photo, which I took with my drone. Now, David then attempted to bring it from Kirjath Jearim up to Jerusalem. Now, he was careless in the manner of transporting it, and following Uzziah's death, after he had tried to catch the ark as it fell off the ox cart, it stayed at the house of Obed-Edom for about 3 months. Now, Obed-Edom was originally from Gath, being a Gittite, but his home at the time was probably on the road between Kirjath Jearim and Jerusalem, where Highway 1 runs today. Now, on his second attempt, 3 months later, David was able to successfully then bring the ark up to Jerusalem into the city of David with great and wonderful fanfare, where it was then located in a tent, either close to his palace or close to the Gihon spring. Now, the tent, however, was not the tent of meeting that had the 2 sections, the holy place and the most holy place, where the regular tabernacle service was held. Now, strangely, it seems that the tabernacle and the sacrificial system remained at the high place near Gibeon, even through David's reign, after he brought the ark to Jerusalem. And early into Solomon's reign, it was also there as God appeared to Solomon there before he built the temple. Now, having brought the ark to Jerusalem and seeing it in a tabernacle, David desired to build God a house to honour him. Now, God then tells him that his son will be the one who will be allowed to build the temple. Now, God then promises him that his dynasty, unlike that of Saul, would be an everlasting dynasty over the throne of Israel. Now, at the time that Jerusalem was destroyed later by the Babylonians, Irish legend tells us that Jeremiah brought one of Zedekiah's daughters to Ireland to marry an Irish prince. And as a result of that, we believe that David's throne still exists today through the British royal throne. Now, 2 Samuel 8 gives us an overview of the series of victories that God gave David against all of Israel's neighbours, allowing Israel to have a time of peace later under King Solomon. Now, first he defeats the Philistines to the west, then the Moabites to the east, Zobah and Syria to the north, then Ammon to the east, and then Edom to the southeast. Now, it is during one of these latter wars, the one against Ammon, that David's adulterous affair with Bathsheba takes place. Now, this probably took place when David was probably in his 50s. Now, Psalm 83 tells us of an alliance between Asher and Israel's neighbours conspiring to destroy Israel. Now, one reason why the church has assumed that Psalm 83 is a future prophecy is that we thought that it wasn't fulfilled anciently. However, if we look more carefully, we'll see that there was an ancient fulfilment of this. Now, we read in 1 Chronicles 19 that the Mesopotamians, or Assyrians, and Syrians provided an astonishing number of at least 32,000 chariots to assist Ammon, or the children of Lot, in their rebellion against Israel, which quickly involved other nations. Now, this became an astonishing two-front war where God really helped Israel to an amazing victory. Now, it wasn't for another 150 years in Ahab's time when the Assyrians would again become a force in the Middle East against other nations. Now, in Saul's time, the Philistines saw to it that the Israelites had no blacksmiths to make them iron tools or weapons. Now, after David conquers the Philistines, this whole situation changes, and we read in 1 Chronicles 22:14 that King David prepared iron without measure for the temple of God. Now, King David was a great musician, and he composed over half of the psalms that we sing at church, including Psalm 119 about the law of God, and the songs of ascent which were sung as people went up to Jerusalem for the feasts. Now, during his campaign against Ammon, David stayed back in Jerusalem. Now, one evening he saw a beautiful woman named Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Now, entranced by lust for her and ignoring her marital status, David has her brought to the palace and they have a sexual relationship. Now, Bathsheba later tells David that she is pregnant with his child. Now, David then brings Uriah back from the battle against Ammon and tries to have him sleep with his wife so that Uriah will think he is the father of her child. Now, Uriah doesn't sleep with his wife, and David, in desperation to cover his sin, has him take a sealed message to Joab that instructs Joab to have him exposed to the hottest part of the war, so Uriah is killed, which then happens. Now, to have Uriah killed this way was a wicked thing to do, which greatly angered God. Now, the adultery by itself is an abominable act when you realise that David had at least 7 wives at this point in time. Now, Gary Smalley and John Trent, in their book, The Two Sides of Love, make the point that, almost without exception, our weaknesses are a reflection of our strengths pushed to an extreme. Now, David's strength was his passion. But his major weakness was not controlling his passions, such as his sexual desires. Now, Bathsheba probably had quite a curvaceous figure to have impacted King David from such a distance. Still, David should have pulled back immediately and not allowed his passions to get the better of him. Now, sexual desires once stirred up are extremely difficult to rein back in. Now, when those desires are for someone we are not married to, we cannot let them be stirred up in the first place. Now, this brings us to the third lesson that we can learn from King David. Don't linger, but flee away from sexual temptation. Or, put another way, when it comes to sexual temptation, run, Forrest, run. Now, while the affair is initiated by David, there is no record of any hint of resistance on Bathsheba's part, even though she may have cried out as required in a statute about rape in Deuteronomy 22:24. Now, we don't know for sure whether or not she was being immodest with her bathing. Now, her bathing was certainly visible to her neighbours, so unwittingly she may have been. Now, while I have occasionally seen ladies in the church dress immodestly from time to time, it has always seems to be done unwittingly from what I have seen. Now, that said, our ladies in the church do need to take care not to accidentally put a stumbling block before our men in the church. It is important to remember that this world throws an awful lot of visual temptation at our men in the church. And it really is great when our ladies are discreet and do not accidentally add to that existing pressure. Now, when Nathan confronts David with a crafty parable, David is convicted and repents of his great sins, but the child dies as punishment for the adultery and murder. Now, everything was on the line at this moment. Had he not responded to the prophet when his sins are so craftily pointed out to him, he probably would have lost the Holy Spirit and he would have gone down the same path as Saul, becoming a bitter, self-willed old man. Now, thankfully, when confronted with his horrible sins, he made no excuses. Faced with the reality of transgressing God's law, David said, "I have sinned against the Lord." Now, this willingness to repent when corrected was ultimately what made the difference between David and Saul. Now, Saul's 2 sins that had him rejected as kings were making a sacrifice when he wasn't allowed to, and sparing the spoil and Agag in the Amalek campaign. Now, to some degree, these were lesser sins than David's. Now, God is much more interested in our willingness to repent and change from our sins, regardless of whether they are big or small sins. Now, this brings us to our 4th lesson that we can learn from King David's life. Take responsibility for your sins and change your ways. Don't resist correction like Saul did, but repent like David did. Now, in relation to David's ruling as a king and a judge, we're told that he administered judgment and justice, which is sometimes translated as righteousness as well. Now, the Hebrew words for these two are mishpat, which refers to the letter of the law, and tzedakah, which is the spirit of the law. Now, tzedakah can be either an increase or a decrease of the mishpat, or the letter of the law, depending on extenuating circumstances. Now, there can be mercy at times a judge will give, decreasing the penalty if there are some extenuating circumstances. Now, Nathan's parable was an example of a case which had extenuating circumstances where justice and the Spirit of the Lord seemed to demand an increase in the normal penalty. Now, restitution of the lamb with a return of 4 lambs was nothing to the rich man out of his abundance. Now, the hard-heartedness of his taking away something so precious to its owner saw David pronounce death on the rich man, not realising it was him who was the man in relation to his adulterous affair. Now, as prophesied by God through Nathan, there is turmoil in David's family life. Now, his firstborn son Amnon rapes one of his half-sisters, Tamar. Now, David did nothing about this sordid affair, and Absalom, who sees in anger over the incident, a couple of years later kills Amnon and then goes into exile. Now, he later returns, announces that he will take over from his father. Now, David with Bathsheba then flees Jerusalem. Now, Absalom enters Jerusalem and violates all of David's wives and concubines. And battle breaks out between the two sides. And in the battle, Absalom gets his hair caught in an oak tree and is killed by Joab. Now, when it came to his family, he spared the rod and did not correct his sons when needed. Now, David did not punish Amnon as he should have. Now, if Amnon had received punishment, Absalom's anger may have been abated and all this conflict could have possibly been avoided. Now, this brings us to our 5th lesson that we can learn from King David's life. Show both love and discipline to your children. Now, both love and discipline are required in a balanced way to raise good children. Now, discipline plus affection leads to obedient, secure, balanced children. Discipline with little affection leads to provoked, angry children. Now, affection minus discipline leads to spoiled, rebellious children. And no affection and no discipline equals rebellion and anarchy. Now, it's interesting too, during the hymns that we had, the second hymn refers to the time of Absalom's rebellion when Ahithophel, I think his name was, who was David's friend and counsellor, betrays him and turns to the other side. So that second song we sung refers to that particular incident. Now, on his return to Jerusalem, 2 Samuel 20 verse 3 says that David took all his wives and concubines, with the exception of Bathsheba, who he took with him, and put them in a house under guard and provided for them, but did not go into them. Now, David here finally repents of his polygamy. Now, it appears that Bathsheba was his favourite wife, despite the scandalous affair, and despite the fact that the Bible says that Abigail had both good looks and good character. Now, by this time, Israel has become a rich and very powerful nation that is controlling many nations around it that David has defeated. Now, in 2 Samuel 24:1, it says that David was angry not just with David, but with the whole nation, most likely because of its pride. Now, in a parallel account in 1 Chronicles 21:1, it says that Satan moved David to take a census. Now, it appeared that God allowed this to see if David would be carried away with the nation's pride, if that was indeed what God was angry about. Now, he does, and a plague killing 70,000 people was the tragic result of this foolish mistake that David made and then later repented of. Now, shortly before David's death, Adonijah conspired to be the next king. Now, on hearing this, Bathsheba and Nathan remind David of his promise to make Bathsheba's son, Solomon, the next king. Now, David then has Solomon anointed the next king, and Adonijah's followers quickly turn away from him. Now, Solomon's mother, Bathsheba, was David's 8th wife, yet Solomon is chosen after Bathsheba becomes his sole wife following the rebellion of Absalom. Now, 1 Chronicles 28:5 tells us that God was the one who made the choice of heir to David. Now, one thing that is noticeably absent in David's many final instructions to Solomon was any emphasis on keeping the laws of God that God specifically had for the kings of Israel, in particular the one against polygamy. Now, sadly, Solomon would break this one and ramp it up to a whole new level, committing polygamy on an industrial scale. Now, when David died, he was buried in the city of David. Now, when other kings died, there was a recurring statement in the book of the Kings that they rested with their fathers and buried in the city of David. Now, in the case of some unrighteous kings like Jehoram in 2 Kings 8:24, we're specifically told that the king was not buried in the tomb of the kings. Now, even though most of the bodies of Egyptian pharaohs have been found, no bodies or bones have ever been found that can be identified with any of the kings of Judah. Now, there are empty rock-cut tombs in the lower Kidron Valley just up from the Pool of Siloam, and some have identified these as a tomb of the kings. Now, these rock-cut tombs are actually outside the walls of the city of David, so it is unlikely that these were where the tombs of the kings were. So if this wasn't the case, just where were the tombs of the kings of Judah? Now, when the prophet Samuel died, the Israelites are said to have buried him in his house at Ramah. Now, in the Biblical Archaeological Review article called Lost Tombs of the Israelite Kings in the July-August 2007 issue, Norma Franklin described an interesting find regarding the palace of the Israelite king Omri, which was discovered in Samaria. And Norma wrote that the builders carved a platform out of rock at one of the region's higher points, similar to how David's palace was constructed. Now, Franklin believes she located two tombs under Omri's palace, situated below the large courtyard of the palace. Now, in her article, Norma quoted Isaiah 14:18, which says, "All the kings of the nations, even all of them, lie in glory, everyone in his own house." Now, the king's tomb, Norma says, symbolised his house, which is why they were constructed underneath the palace. David and his descendants from Rehoboam to Ahaz were all buried in their houses, that is, in their palaces, she wrote. Now, archaeologists have also found evidence that monarchs of neighbouring kingdoms, including the kings and queens of Assyria and 5 Babylonian kings, were also buried in their palaces. Now, further supporting the possibility that David, Solomon and the kings of Judah were buried under David's palace, we read in Ezekiel 43:7 that the bodies of the kings of Judah were in high places, not low like is proposed in that previous slide. Now, the Apostle Peter in his Pentecost sermon also indicated that David was buried and his tomb was with those in the 1st century. Now, millions of tourists have visited the Valley of the Kings with their underground tombs characterised by long entry shafts, anterooms, followed by the burial chamber with fabulous treasures. Now, we see echoes of this style in Josephus' account of 2 visitations of David's tomb. Now, Josephus wrote the following in Antiquities of the Jews. He, referring to David, was buried by his son Solomon in Jerusalem with great magnificence and with all the other funeral pomp which kings used to be buried with. Moreover, he had great and immense wealth buried with him. Hyrcanus the high priest, when he was besieged by Antiochus, this is in the time of the Maccabees, and was desirous of giving him money to get him to raise the siege and draw off his army, and having no other method of compassing the money, opened one room of David's sepulchre and took out 3,000 talents and gave part of that sum to Antiochus, and by this means caused the siege to be raised. Nay, after him King Herod opened another room, yet neither of them came at the coffins of the kings themselves. As for any money, he, talking about Herod, found none, but that furniture of gold and those precious goods that were laid up there, all which he took away. However, he had a great desire to make a more diligent search and to go further in, even as far as the very bodies of David and Solomon, where two of his guards were slain by a flame that burst out upon them that went in, as the report was. So he was terribly affrighted and went out and built a perpetual monument of that fright he had been in. End of quote. Now you really get the impression that God is very protective of the resting place of King David. Now less than half of David's palace has been excavated so far. Now might it be possible that they will find a secret entrance to the tombs of the kings and make a monumental discovery? Now that would be very cool if they did find the tombs of David and Solomon and the kings of Judah. Now in 1 Kings 15:5 we read this summary of David's life. David did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He had not turned away from anything he commanded all the days of his life, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. Now John Wesley has this to say in his commentary about this verse. Save only. This is to be understood as exclusive of every single action, but only as a habitual and continued apostasy from God, as the very phrase of turning aside from God. Now David's other sins were either sudden and transient acts, soon repented of and blotted out, whereas that which concerned Uriah's wife was a designed and studied sin, long continued in, defended with a succession of other sins, presumptuous and scandalous to his government and to the true religion. End of quote. Now remember, it was only after the child was born from adultery that he confessed and repented of his sin, which meant that he had turned his back on God for close to a full year. Now Herbert Armstrong, in his book Military Service and War, writes the following about King David. David was a man after God's own heart, not because of his wars, his fighting, his killing. God punished him for that. What did endear David to God was, first of all, David's willingness to admit it when he was wrong and to repent. David loved and obeyed God's law. His attitude was right. He was humble, yet he was strong and unafraid. He was fair in his dealings. He respected authority and those over him. He was compassionate and merciful. He was honest and straightforward. David had many wives, but if you will research the record carefully, you'll perhaps be surprised to find that he repented of this, put away his concubines, and in his latter years had only one wife. David sinned, but he acknowledged his sins and repented. End of quote. So in conclusion, David lived a remarkable life of highs and lows, with great mistakes and great feats done for God. He was a master musician, a great warrior, a great king, and a man after God's own heart. Now his story will continue in the millennium when he will be resurrected and under Jesus Christ rule over the 12 tribes of Israel, working closely with the 12 apostles will be over each of those tribes. So let us learn from the 5 key lessons that we've drawn out from the life of David. Let us, 1, courageously and completely trust God as David did in his young years. 2, use kindness and humility and not retaliation as a way to restore broken relationships. 3, not linger but flee away from sexual temptation. 4, be willing to take responsibility for our sins the way that David did. And 5, show both love and discipline with our children.